welcome to My Life, My Business. Wish I was here. And a warm welcome to my co-host Shanaz. We really talk about a variety of topics, and it's all about how we engage with what we do, how we engage with our careers, our business within organizations, and um, and also therefore in the end is understanding that we want to live a joyful existence. It's not something that is, in the end, something that's unattainable. It is certainly something that if you consciously think about all kinds of, um, and specifically the things that we talk about, everything geared towards, and it doesn't matter what the topic is living a life of joy with the people around you. And anyway, without further ado, um, last week we spoke a little bit about what risk and uncertainty is, and achieving success despite what risks are, and also what effective decision making looks like when you can assess risk. But anyway, you can go and listen to the playback on Clubhouse, or you can listen to the edited version on our YouTube channel, the Mufasa Coaching Practice. But today, Shanaz is going to take us through a topic, and as it is, it's always a surprise. But I tell you what, it's always a pleasant surprise. So Shanaz, over to you.
Hi, Shak and everyone in the room. So last week, you were talking about the risk and sort of measured risks, and are we, the importance of that, and it actually made me think about the importance of well, not the importance of it, but it made me think of vulnerability. So um over the past couple of years, the author and academic Brené Brown has been sort of discussed and unpacked the topic of vulnerability. And so I'm going to talk about vulnerability today in the work and family spaces. And also, I think a little bit of how it's connected to leadership, and I think that the reason why I wanted to talk about this is that that connection, that sometimes vulnerability is also risking, risking to be seen and to kind of being exposed. So there are many definitions of what vulnerability is, but I kind of wanted to read one or two of Brene Brown's quotes on vulnerability. For those who don't know Brene Brown, she is actually a social work academic, and she based her work in educational leadership, and has gone into business sort of as well, business leadership. And she has based her work on research, so that kind of already kind of makes me interested in her work, and I've read one or two of her books. But anyway, so one of her quotes is that vulnerability is not winning or losing, it's having the courage to show up and be seen when we have no control over the outcome. And that sort of entails a little bit of risk. So I want you to think about, how do you define vulnerability? And why am I talking about vulnerability in the work and family spaces? Um, is that when we are in our work or our organizational space, we are not only that person. We are not only the leader, we are not only the boss. And I've read an interesting article just in kind of preparation for today in my discussion on vulnerability. And there was she's also in educational leadership, and I was deciding whether I agree with her or not. She wrote an article and sort of posted in LinkedIn, and she was saying that vulnerability has become like a trendy word, and she doesn't think that the word vulnerability is useful in or how people interpret it is not necessarily useful in the workspace. So I'm gonna, kind of chat through a bit of some of this and then kind of come to a conclusion. I have to tell you that I came to the conclusion that actually I disagree with her. But I'm going to kind of talk about that. So I want you to think of how would you define vulnerability, and what does it vulnerability mean to you? So apparently, like when we look at definitions, vulnerability is about mutual self-disclosure, a sense of not knowing, to speak from the heart, the courage to take risks, right? And then also risking emotional exposure. There are some, I was thinking, I am in the UK, and I was here during the riots. um, I cannot separate, and this is where I disagree with, her name's Amanda Moden, I think. I disagree with her idea that vulnerability isn't a good word necessary to use in the workspace, because while we work for an organization, or maybe you a leader of an organization, you are not only that role, you fulfill many roles. And what we are asking, when we expect people to be invulnerable or show no vulnerability, then I think that we are not allowing people to bring themselves fully into the organization. And when I'm saying bring themselves fully into the organization, then I mean bring the part who is the mother, bring the part who is the daughter, bring the part who is the black woman into that space. So we are talking then about, for example, I'm not only an academic and a researcher, I'm an aunt, I'm a black woman. I grew up in a particular community, I grew up in Mitchell's Plain and Athlone. So all of that come with me, and to expect me to kind of not bring that into my workspace is actually asking me not to be vulnerable. And because you're asking me to show up with only certain parts of me, and the rest of me I have to exclude. Because actually, vulnerability, another thing, when we're thinking about vulnerability, it also means about it's also about opening up to the hurt. And I think that people can be hurt in workspaces, in different spaces, in family spaces, in church spaces, in faith-based organization. So I think that, the concept of, for me, the concept of vulnerability does apply in all of these spaces, because we want to bring the best way to kind of engage with what you are doing, and to be a have a fulfilled life and fulfilled relationships which involve real connection and authenticity, is to bring your vulnerable self also to the table. And so one of the things is that, what Brené Brown particularly says, that vulnerability is not needed. Like, I don't have to be vulnerable and well, I'm that kind of person that I want to be authentic when I'm engaging, with my students, with others. But I like what she said. She said that it's not essential. So we can choose not to be vulnerable. But she says, which I fully agree with, but for connection, for transformation, for change to happen, and I also say for reimagining situations, and for hope, we need vulnerability. It's essential. So I'm going to say it again: vulnerability, to be vulnerable in our different spaces, is not essential, but we definitely need it. We don't have to be vulnerable, but we need it. It's absolutely essential for connection, for transformation, for change, for reimagining, and for hope. And so it does mean also risking emotional exposure. And I think, for example, our workspaces traditionally, while I think Amanda, the other author, was talking, is mentioning that she doesn't think it's appropriate, because she believes that one's vulnerabilities can be weaponized and used against you in a workspace. But I'm kind of, I'm not going with, I don't agree with her. There's certain things that I agreed with her that she said, but I don't agree with her. And um, I was preparing this because of a seminar I was doing here while the riots in the UK was going on, and I can, I'm not an asylum seeker, but how are, for example, rioters, who, the far right wing here, how are they going to separate me being an academic from how an asylum seeker looks? So that definitely affected my workspace. How, in fact, they sent emails around to all the staff here that if you feel that you are, live near where the riots are taking place and you feel, that you're going to be targeted, that you stay at home. So we cannot like decide that we cannot bring certain parts of our identity, we leave it at home. In other words, and I'd like you to think that as leaders, and not only as leaders but as family, think of it, many of us lead our families. um, is the question that we were I was discussing and I was talking with the other staff was, do we ever think of designing our workspaces and our family spaces even, and in my case my teaching, do I think of designing it to be spaces where vulnerability is applauded and valued? I think in our society, vulnerability, maybe in America and the Gen Zs, are engaging with vulnerability. But I find in traditional institutions, in retail institutions, in workspaces, and often in family spaces, unfortunately, vulnerability is not valued. It's almost like people want to be seen as invulnerable. They want to be strong. They need to have it together, and they cannot really show the vulnerability. They don't want to risk being vulnerable. And so what, I'd like you to think of, in your organization or your workspace, are you allowed to be vulnerable, or is that not tolerated? And then maybe to think about, even, if you are leading, how do you allow, and I've got to think about this because I was reading some feedback on a course that I taught, and I was thinking about this as well. And do I engage with my students in a way that I'm approachable, and that they can be vulnerable? And from the feedback I'm inconsistent. So apparently, some viewed me that, I am approachable, and others felt students first years can be very honest. Somebody said I was passive aggressive. So, so I'm going to work on that, and engage with the students' feedback. And so, it really is about thinking about the role of vulnerability in the spaces that you engage in regularly, whether that's your workspace, or whether that's for your workspace or your family space. Do your family members think that you're approachable? Can you be vulnerable with them or not? How is vulnerability tolerated in your family or not? Is it valued even? I think that there's a difference between us as a society valuing vulnerability and or tolerating it. And so think a little bit about that space. And then in terms of, as I said, because the reality is that we cannot cut ourselves off and only put the strong person, only put the what it means to be the leader, the one who's in charge, the one who's organizing things, whether that's in your family or whether that's in your workspace. um, because what you will find is when you look at a vulnerability, when we don't engage in it, we can become disconnected with ourselves. And that, I think that the more that we start to engage with vulnerability, our own vulnerability, it actually can be seen as an enabling tool. So often I find that vulnerability, when I'm engaging with my clients and I'm talking about them, we all struggle with it, because it does involve, almost exposing yourself. You don't always know what the outcome is going to be. But what Brene Brown also wants us to think about, but what if we're not vulnerable? What are the risks? We risk disconnection, unhappiness, and isolation. We don't work well in a team. So while we don't have to be vulnerable, I think that the disadvantages, not only to our mental health but to working together, is there's a big, I think that there's quite a disadvantage, and we're not going to experience the kind of transformation and change that can happen in us and around us when we are not vulnerable. And so, what to engage then and to think of vulnerability as a strength or an enabling tool is really valuable. And one of the authors that I enjoy reading, she's an academic, but she writes as well. Her name's Bell Hooks, and she says that when we engage then with our vulnerability, we will have courage to risk. We will also have courage to name our pain and our wounding. So, in other words, when we start to engage with our own vulnerability through, reflecting on it, we start to understand the ways in which we've been hurt, and starting to name and talk and think about the way in which you perhaps have been hurt or wounded or disappointed, etc. That can actually help us deal then with our internal dialogue that often happens to us, and she actually calls it our internal, sometimes the internal oppressor. And what the vulnerability enables us to do is to constructively engage then with frustration, with difficult emotions, with disappointment, with our anger even. And anger can be really important even in vulnerability, as well as our rage, for example, at injustice. But when we deny it, when we are only invulnerable and we present ourselves as always strong, as always having it together, then we disconnect from what's really going on inside of us. And so, to think of then as vulnerability as a really important tool to kind of help the process. So, what I've also then learned is that it's so to be vulnerable is actually also to engage with our humanness, our own humanity, and that then helps us really to kind of connect with others, because you can start to understand yourself in a new way. You can also understand your staff, and your employees, or even your organization, in new ways, as well as your family, when you start to think about and engage with your own vulnerability. And I think that we all want to have hope. We all want authenticity, transparency, and connection. But it can really only happen when we are vulnerable. It's a struggle. It's difficult to achieve when we are not vulnerable. And so, what I found useful about Amanda's work, though, I didn't, disagree with everything. So she actually makes recommendations, and hers is like, so how can we have healthy workspaces? Because her concern was like we're all going to become like. Her concern was that sometimes people's vulnerabilities can be used against them. I see, Jacques, you said invulnerability really doesn't really show strength. And yes, for me, invulnerability is not really a show of strength. And in fact, Brené Brown actually calls it. She says that vulnerability is a strength, because of how it can, the insight that it can lead you to. And so Amanda suggests, like, maybe we need to think about transparency, authenticity in our workspaces, because I think her views are that our vulnerabilities in a workspace may be used against us. And but for me, I think that that starts to create a toxic work environment, because like I said, I cannot cut off who I am. If I'm a mother, if I'm a daughter, if I'm an aunt, and something happens to me or my family, I'm going to want to share it with my boss, with my manager. And so I don't, but she makes some really good recommendations in terms of how we can have true healthy working spaces. And I'm aware of the time, and so I'll just mention a couple that she says. So I think that what she's saying is that to be vulnerable is starting actually at a positive place. But so what she would see it as, that we want to then in our workspaces encourage people, and as leaders we need to admit mistakes and shortcomings, instead of hiding or downplaying our errors. There needs to be a willingness to ask for help, and we need to be open about the areas where additional training is needed. And so I want, if you maybe not leading an organization, but if you, or even as a family member, you know, in our families, is it okay to admit that we've made mistakes and shortcomings, or do we not tolerate it? Can we ask for help in our families? She also says, an ability to share professional challenges and uncertainties without the fear of judgment or retribution. So being willing to show yourself and not worried that the boss is going to penalize you, or that you are going to be judged because of that. She talks about, she says, having an emotional awareness that leads us to understand and manage our emotions and be considerate of the emotions of others, a belief in creating a culture of learning. And I really like that this idea of continuous learning, that we are all, whether we are in our workspaces or in our families, but that we develop this culture of ongoing learning, that I'm never going to be the expert. I'm never going to be the person that knows it all, even though I may be the leader or the head of this household, or I may lead a module, or I'm the lecturer. I am not the expert. I need to be able to admit to my students that I made an error in the course outline. That yes, I can understand when you say that the course was a bit not coherent as much as what you'd like. And she talks about that maybe then, she says, of having a balanced, honest, straightforward approach and being more compassionate. So that's her ideas of how we can sort of be vulnerable, encourage others to be vulnerable. And as I said, I think that one of the things that Brene Brown talks about then is, that she also thinks that through this process we do need to have support. So you don't just want to be vulnerable and that's it, and sometimes that can be difficult, and you can find yourself isolated. And I really think that part of the idea is to create safe spaces, alternative spaces, and an environment where our staff and our employees and our family members even, can know that this now is a safe space, or that we are having our environment, our workspace is one that I can bring all of who I am, even when it's on a bad day. even when I didn't get it right, and even when I'm angry. And I think that that can allow for it, allow ourselves then to be vulnerable, but others to be vulnerable as well. So yeah, so that's a little bit about vulnerability, and yeah, I'm going to um, any comments.
It's actually quite interesting is that I've been dispensing, prescribing Brené Brown's work on vulnerability to some of my clients, uh, some in the workplace. And I was actually quite pleasantly surprised that one of my clients today, in fact, mentioned that in terms of the work that he's doing, started watching Brené Brown videos, and he's watched several of her videos now on YouTube. Um, so, but I have a question for you. I mean, fascinated by this because it kind of it in many ways it's what she teaches and what you're talking about is counterintuitive, meaning in a context of conflict, Shanaz, is vulnerability then not seen then as a weakness?
Yeah, I mean, that's always a question about, I think it's the context. I think that that's the culture and the environment that has been created. And I think that historically and in certain workplaces, that vulnerability is seen as a weakness. And I think that as leaders, if you start to work on that, and if you really want real connection, and you want authenticity, and you want change to happen, um, then you have to engage and create an environment that will allow people to be vulnerable. If you don't create that, you're going to have the same of the same. You're going to continue with the status quo.
Mm. I mean, within the energy leadership framework that we use, is that a leader who's not prepared to show a vulnerable side is not trusted. Interestingly enough.
Yeah, and I think that that's very true. That's why I found this LinkedIn article by Amanda very interesting, because I
Mm,
think it's almost leaning into what she's, and there's a part of me that understand it. It's, she was saying like, you need to be aware of people's boundaries. You cannot burden others with your emotional stuff actually. But
mm,
and I hear where that's coming from, because what I've been finding even internationally is people sort of complaining about, oh, everyone, and particularly among students, and the Gen Zs, are just talking about mental health, and everyone is vulnerable. And so she's concerned about that, and I see that she's also in an educational environment. But I think that there needs to be a space for that. I think
mm,
that if something has happened to a family member, must I keep it in and wait until I'm feeling better and not tell you as an employee that
mm,
something has happened to an important family member, you know?
mm,
Um,
mm,
and so I think that there should be space
mm,
for people's vulnerability. And I think
mm,
that it depends on the kind of culture you want to develop in your workspace, that will make people open to coming to you. But I also think that people need to be supported in that process,
mm.
because historically and in the vast majority of institutions or organizations, vulnerability is still seen as a weakness.
Yeah, there are so many messages, counter messages that I think everything, if it's not in its right context, that whole fake it until you make it kind of approach, in so many ways, is show confidence, right? Show competence. Don't show any anxiety. Be calm. So I think those things have a place in themselves. But I think the understanding, and I think here's probably the nub of my own understanding, is the willingness when you talk about authenticity, the willingness to be who you are. And, and I know that imposter syndrome is real because of expectations around us, so especially in the workplace, where, yes, when you're talking about what she's saying, is unfortunately in the workplace, it can be exploited. It certainly can. But is that the truth? And probably I can, from my own musings, leave it there. Is it the truth or is it perception of reality?
Are you asking me or are you sorry?
I'm leaving a dangling
You
question out
you're
there.
leaving a dangling question. Okay, well we can leave it dangling. That's quite okay.
But Shanaz, that is certainly awesome, and I think it's really topical, and I think it's something that, I mean, especially when you bring up Brene Brown and the amount of work that she has done, the research that she has done, working in this area, as over so many years. I came across her in 2012, and 12 years later, she's still working in these areas of vulnerability, shame, these kinds of things, and so important to break the paradigm that we have. So an important topic. So I'm hoping that you will take this as an onion and just take it and peel it layer by layer and expose the essence of it all so that we all embrace it, with a willingness without the fear. So thank you. Yeah. So maybe it's a unreasonable request, but yeah, I'm leaving it out there for you to consider. So without further ado, thank you, Shanaz. Thank you for listening, and yeah, we will meet with you next week again. And for those listening to the playback, please feel free to join us anytime on Clubhouse. Find My Life, My Business, and join us for our event every Monday at 5:30. Bye for
Thank
now.
you. Bye. So you'll be doing next week then.
So it seems, yes.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, bye.
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 Enjoy. Bye.